What if the man you humiliated, framed, and destroyed was actually your new boss? Malcolm Hayes walked into Horizon Haven Resorts as a janitor, but what no one knew was that he was the billionaire heir to the entire empire. He faced racism, injustice, and betrayal. But now it's time for payback. How will he expose the corrupt leaders who tried to break him? How will they react when they realize they targeted the wrong man? Stay until the end to witness the ultimate reckoning. If you love stories of justice and redemption, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over Horizon Haven Resorts, one of the most luxurious and exclusive vacation destinations in the country. Perched on a private coastline, the resort boasted sprawling marble lobbies, chandeliers made of imported crystals, and the kind of polished elegance that only the ultra-wealthy could afford. The kind of place where money wasn't just power, it was identity. At the grand entrance, a procession of luxury vehicles lined up, dropping off well-dressed guests who stepped out in designer shoes, tailored suits, and glistening jewelry. The doormen, trained to recognize VIPs by their appearance alone, rushed forward to greet them with deep bows and polished smiles. But one man who arrived that evening did not step out of a Rolls-Royce or a Bentley. Instead, he parked an old, worn-out motorcycle at the far end of the employee lot, well away from the valets. His clothes were simple: a faded hoodie, jeans that had seen better days, and a backpack slung over one shoulder. To anyone watching, he looked like a man barely making ends meet, and that was exactly what he wanted them to think. And Malcolm Hayes inhaled deeply, taking in the towering sight of his father's empire. He had grown up knowing that one day, this resort and its international branches would be his. But today, he wasn't walking in as an heir. He was walking in as a nobody. Rumors had reached him from multiple sources. Whispers of racial discrimination, unjust promotions, and unspoken rules that kept black and minority employees trapped in low-pay positions, unable to rise. Malcolm needed to see it with his own eyes, and to do that, he needed to become just another invisible worker in his family's empire. He adjusted his backpack and stepped forward. This was the beginning of something big. Malcolm barely made it to the main entrance before he was stopped. A tall man in a sharp, tailored navy suit stood near the revolving glass doors, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. His name was Ethan Reynolds, the resort's general manager, and the kind of man who believed power belonged to people who looked like him. He looked Malcolm up and down, his cold blue eyes assessing him in an instant. "You lost?" Ethan asked, voice dripping with casual superiority. Malcolm met his gaze, his face neutral. "No, sir. I'm here to apply for a job." A slow, disbelieving chuckle escaped Ethan's lips. He tilted his head slightly. "A job? Here?" His eyes flickered toward the luxury vehicles pulling up behind Malcolm, as if the very idea of someone like him working at Horizon Haven was laughable. Malcolm remained calm. "Yes, I'll take anything available." Ethan let out a mock sigh, shaking his head. Then, without even pretending to check any openings, he smirked. "I don't think we're hiring." Malcolm didn't budge. "Are you sure?" That was when Ethan's expression darkened just slightly. He wasn't used to being questioned by someone he had already decided was beneath him. With exaggerated disinterest, Ethan turned to a nearby receptionist, a woman in her mid-30s with blonde hair pulled into a severe bun. She was too eager to agree with Ethan, barely glancing at her computer before responding with a mocking glint in her eye. "Well, actually," she said, dragging out the words, "the janitorial team is looking for help." Ethan turned back to Malcolm, his smirk widening. "So, what do you say? You wanted an opportunity, right?" A few employees nearby snickered under their breath. The message was clear. This was all Malcolm was worth to them. But Malcolm simply smiled. "I'll take it." Ethan's smirk faltered just a little. He had expected humiliation, hesitation, anything but quiet confidence. "Good," Ethan finally said, shaking off his momentary confusion. "Report to housekeeping tomorrow morning. And don't be late. The following morning, Malcolm stepped into a world that most resort guests never saw. The employee hallways, far from the elegance of the main resort, were dimly lit, with old linoleum floors and the faint scent of bleach. It was a stark contrast to the sparkling lobbies above. Here workers bustled back and forth, some moving so fast they didn't even acknowledge his presence. The break room was cramped, filled with exhausted faces, some sipping cheap coffee from paper cups, others rubbing aching feet from hours of non-stop labor. Malcolm barely had time to take it in before she arrived. Clara Whitmore, the head of housekeeping, but more importantly, the one who held complete authority over every janitor, housekeeper, and maintenance worker. She was tall, with icy green eyes that could cut through steel and a scowl that seemed permanently etched onto her face. She carried herself with the confidence of a woman who knew she could make or break someone's day. And today, she had chosen Malcolm. "You?" Clara barked the moment she spotted him. Malcolm turned, barely managing a "yes, ma'am" before she was in his face. "You're the new janitor?" Her eyes raked over him with open disdain. "Yes." She rolled her eyes so hard it was a miracle they didn't fall out. "Fantastic. Another one." Her tone made it clear. Another one meant someone like him. Then, without warning, she shoved a mop and bucket into his hands. "You see that hallway?" She pointed to the long stretch of marble leading to the staff. "Only restrooms. I want it spotless." Malcolm nodded and got to work. But just as he finished mopping every inch, Clara reappeared. "Do it again." Malcolm blinked. Clara crossed her arms, cutting him off. "You missed a spot." Malcolm looked down. The floor was immaculate, reflecting the overhead lights. Still, he picked up the mop again. This was only the beginning. The following days were a test of endurance. Trash mysteriously appeared on floors Malcolm had just cleaned. A sink accidentally overflowed, forcing him to mop up a mess he hadn't caused. Breaks were shortened or skipped altogether. And yet, through it all, Malcolm never lost his temper. One afternoon, after wiping down a spotless conference table, Clara walked in. Without a word, she picked up a full cup of coffee and threw it across the surface. The dark liquid splattered everywhere, dripping onto the pristine floor. Malcolm stared at the mess, then back at Clara. "Clean it again," she smirked, arms crossed, eyes daring him to react. The room fell silent. Other employees stopped in their tracks, some watching in amusement, others looking away in discomfort. Malcolm exhaled slowly and grabbed a fresh cloth. As he wiped the table down again, one thought played in his mind. They think they own me. They have no idea who I am. But soon, they will, because this game was only just beginning. The next few weeks at Horizon Haven Resorts were nothing short of a war zone. Malcolm had expected challenges, but the level of racial discrimination, arrogance, and power abuse he witnessed was beyond anything he could have imagined. He had entered this resort pretending to be powerless, but with each day, each humiliation, each moment of injustice, his resolve grew stronger. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every black and minority worker who had been silenced, belittled, and ignored in this empire his father had built. And soon they would all know who he really was. "You're not the right fit." One afternoon, Malcolm was cleaning the hallway near the executive offices when he heard raised voices coming from the HR meeting room. He wasn't the type to eavesdrop, but when he recognized the voice of Deshaun Carter, the black concierge, he slowed his steps. "I've been here for 5 years. I've trained every single concierge who's worked under me. And you're telling me I wasn't even considered?" Deshaun's voice was controlled, but the frustration bled through. A condescending voice responded. "Deshaun, we appreciate your service, but this decision was about company image." Malcolm froze in place. He knew what that meant. He took a small step closer and peered through the slightly open doorway. Sitting at the head of the table was none other than Ethan Reynolds, looking bored, spinning a pen between his fingers as if this conversation wasn't worth his time. Across from him, Deshawn sat rigid, jaw clenched. Malcolm's gaze flickered to the other candidate. A young white man, mid-20s, expensive suit, nervous hands gripping a resume. Malcolm's stomach turned. He already knew the outcome. "We're looking for someone who represents the kind of clientele we attract here," Ethan continued smoothly, flashing his classic power-hungry smirk. "And while you've been great, we think Daniel is a better fit for our luxury image." Daniel, the young inexperienced white man, didn't even look comfortable in his seat. It was clear he wasn't qualified. Deshawn exhaled slowly. "So that's what this is about." Ethan's smile widened. "It's about who fits the brand." Silence. Malcolm clenched his fists. There was no logic, no fairness, no integrity. Just another highly skilled black man being passed over for someone with the right look. Finally, Deshawn stood shaking his head. "You know what? I hope your brand serves you well, because one day you're going to regret treating people like this." He turned, marching toward the door, straight toward Malcolm. Malcolm quickly ducked back and resumed wiping down a glass window as Deshawn stormed past. Ethan's voice followed. "Oh, and Deshawn, let's keep this professional. Don't cause a scene." Malcolm watched as Deshawn clenched his fists, trembling with rage, before disappearing down the hall. Malcolm had seen enough. This resort wasn't just racist in whispers in back rooms. It was systemic, deliberate, and calculated. And now, he was going to burn it down from the inside. That evening, Horizon Haven Resorts held one of its most extravagant events of the year, the Crystal Gala. A ballroom filled with high society elites, polished floors that gleamed under golden chandeliers, and servers gliding through the room carrying glasses of expensive champagne on silver trays. Malcolm had been assigned to clean up the aftermath, but as he walked past the grand staircase, he heard his name. "Janitor!" He turned, and there was Ethan smirking, dressed in an expensive tuxedo, holding a full tray of crystal champagne flutes. "Catch!" Before Malcolm could react, Ethan shoved the entire tray toward him. The delicate glasses crashed onto the marble floor, the expensive golden liquid splashing across Malcolm's uniform. The room fell silent. Gasps, murmurs, a few amused chuckles. Malcolm slowly looked up at Ethan, his breathing controlled but his chest burning with fury. Ethan raised his hands in mock innocence. "Oops. Guess you better clean that up, janitor." The humiliation was thick in the air. He could feel every pair of eyes on him. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others smirked. And Ethan? He was loving every second of it. Malcolm clenched his fists. But he knew better. Not yet. Instead, he knelt, slowly picking up the shattered pieces, one by one, because Ethan had just made his biggest mistake. The next morning, Malcolm was summoned to security. When he arrived, Clara stood there, arms crossed, a nasty grin on her face. Beside her, 2 security officers held a guest's expensive gold wallet. And at the center of it all, Malcolm's locker, forced open. His heart pounded. "Malcolm Hayes, we have reason to believe you stole from a guest," the lead officer said, his voice stiff. Malcolm stared at the wallet, then back at Clara, who was barely containing her glee. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice steady but cold. Clara snorted. "Oh, sure. A randomly missing wallet just happens to turn up in your locker? That's quite a coincidence." The officers grabbed his arms. "Wait!" Malcolm's voice was sharp, controlled, dangerous. They hesitated. "Check the security cameras." Clara visibly stiffened. One of the officers looked at her. "Ma'am, should we?" Clara cut in fast. "Oh, please. We can't waste time reviewing footage every time someone gets caught stealing. He was seen near the guest's suite. That's enough proof." Malcolm clenched his jaw. She was trying to get rid of him. And the worst part? She was winning. "Take him to holding," the officer ordered. Malcolm spent the entire night locked in a small, cold security office. No food, no water, no explanation, just silence. And as he sat there, his mind raced. This isn't about a job. This isn't just about me. This is about every black and minority worker who's been mistreated in places like this. Then, his thoughts drifted to his mother. A housekeeper at a different luxury hotel. A woman who worked herself to exhaustion every day, only to be fired over a false accusation of theft. He clenched his fists. It's happening again. But this time, he wasn't going to let them win. The next day, something happened that changed everything. Malcolm had barely returned to work when he saw it. An elderly black housekeeper, Mrs. Johnson, was scrubbing the floors on her hands and knees. Sweat poured down her face. Her hands shook from exhaustion. She needed a break. Malcolm stepped forward to help, but before he could, Clara appeared. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped. Malcolm straightened. "She needs rest. She's dehydrated." Clara laughed. "So, that's not your concern. Get back to work." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "She's going to collapse." Clara's eyes gleamed with cruelty. And then she said it. "People like you are replaceable." And in that very moment, Mrs. Johnson collapsed. Her body hit the floor hard. Shouts erupted. Employees rushed toward her. Someone called for a medic. Malcolm dropped to his knees, grabbing her hand. Her pulse was weak. He looked up, his vision blurring with rage. Ethan stood in the distance, watching, unbothered. Malcolm slowly reached into his pocket and hit record. Malcolm has endured humiliation, sabotage, and outright racism, yet he refuses to break. How would you feel in his place? Imagine working hard, only to be mocked, framed, and treated as if you were invisible. Would you have the strength to keep going? Clara and Ethan believe they've won, but they have no idea who they're dealing with. Malcolm's fight isn't over. It's just beginning. If you're rooting for Malcolm to expose the truth and take back his power, show your support. Hit that like button, comment below, and let's stand against injustice together. Stay tuned for the next. The night after Mrs. Johnson collapsed, the atmosphere at Horizon Haven Resorts was tense. Whispers circulated through the employee quarters. Some workers were genuinely shaken by the elderly housekeeper's condition, while others pretended nothing had happened, fearing for their jobs. But Malcolm? He was done being silent. He had endured weeks of humiliation. He had been mocked, belittled, overworked, falsely accused, and locked away without food or water. But watching an elderly woman collapse from sheer exhaustion, while Ethan and Clara stood by as if she were nothing, was his final breaking point. No more. It was time to fight back. The next morning, Malcolm walked into the grand dining hall where Clara was finishing her breakfast, sipping coffee like she hadn't just watched someone nearly die. Nearby, a table full of executives sat chatting, Ethan among them. Malcolm walked right up to Clara's table and dropped a mop onto it. The entire room fell silent. Clara's head snapped up, her face twisting with disbelief. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. Malcolm folded his arms, his voice calm, steady, but laced with fire. "Clean your own mess." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Ethan stopped mid-conversation, turning toward the commotion. Clara's face turned bright red. "Excuse me?" Malcolm stood his ground. "You threw coffee across a table last week and made me clean it," he said. Loudly, clearly, so that every single person in the room could hear. "You let a woman work herself unconscious. You don't get to order me around anymore." The entire dining hall was watching now. Clara's hand tightened around her coffee cup. "You're nothing but a janitor," she hissed, her voice low but venomous. Malcolm smirked. "Not for long." He turned to walk away. Clara shot to her feet, shaking with rage. This wasn't just about power anymore. This was personal. And she was about to make damn sure he paid for this. Less than an hour later, Malcolm was cleaning a guest suite when security stormed in. "Hands up! Step away from the nightstand!" Malcolm frowned, holding up his hands. "What's this about?" The head of security, a bulky, grim-faced man named Henderson, marched straight to his locker and forced it open. Inside, sitting perfectly positioned on his folded work shirt, was a gold Rolex watch. Malcolm's stomach dropped. Not again. "That's not mine," he said, voice even. Clara stepped into the doorway, arms crossed, eyes gleaming. "Oh, really? Because it was reported missing from a guest suite just this morning, and guess what? The cameras conveniently weren't working in that hallway." Malcolm's jaw clenched. They weren't even trying to make it look real this time. Henderson took a step forward. "Mr. Hayes, we have no choice but to take him straight to the lobby." Ethan's voice cut through the air. Malcolm turned his head and saw Ethan standing just outside the door, smirking. Ethan stepped forward, brushing a piece of lint from his suit. "This time, we do this publicly." Malcolm was dragged through the main resort lobby like a criminal. Guests turned their heads. Some paused mid-check-in, whispering to each other. Employees stared, some in shock, others in silent approval. Ethan savored every second of it. When they reached the center of the lobby, Ethan held up a hand, signaling security to stop. Then, with a grin that reeked of cruelty, he turned to the watching guests and employees. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, projecting his voice across the lobby. "This man, this janitor, was caught stealing from one of our valued guests. And because we do not tolerate thieves in our establishment," he turned back to Malcolm, eyes gleaming with power, "he is permanently banned from Horizon Haven resorts, effective immediately." Silence. The public disgrace was worse than any physical punishment. A slow, cold rage spread through Malcolm's veins. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Malcolm could hear. "You should have stayed in your place." Malcolm clenched his fists. He was seconds away from throwing a punch, from tearing Ethan apart, from burning this entire place down. But then, a new voice cut through the air, a voice Malcolm knew very well. "What the hell is going on here?" The lobby froze. The moment Victor Hayes stepped through the entrance, time stopped. Dressed in a sleek gray suit, his face sharp with authority, Malcolm's father was a force of power. Employees straightened their postures, guests whispered, and the air itself seemed to crackle with tension. Ethan's smirk dropped instantly. Clara's face went ghost white. Victor's eyes locked onto Malcolm, and then they flickered to the security officers holding him. His expression turned thunderous. "Someone explain to me why my son is being manhandled in my own damn resort." Gasps, murmurs, stunned silence. Ethan's entire body stiffened. Clara actually stumbled backward. One of the receptionists dropped her pen. Malcolm's secret was out. Ethan took a slow, staggering step forward. Sir, there must be some mistake." Victor cut him off with a sharp glare. "You start talking, now." Ethan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Victor turned to Malcolm. "Son, what's going on?" Malcolm straightened his uniform. And then, for the first time, he smiled. "I think you should ask them." He gestured to Ethan and Clara, his eyes burning with quiet victory. Victor's gaze snapped back to Ethan. Ethan blanched. Clara tried to slip away, but Victor caught her. "Stay right where you are." Henderson, the head of security, was already sweating. Victor took a deep, slow breath. Then he turned to the entire room and said the words that sent shockwaves through the resort. "Let's make something very clear. This man is not just any employee." He took a step forward, his presence commanding the entire space. "This is my son." Dead silence. A few guests visibly gasped. An employee dropped their phone. Clara looked like she wanted to disappear. Ethan? Ethan looked like his soul had left his body. Victor let the moment hang. Let them suffocate in their mistakes. Then, he turned back to Malcolm. Son, tell me exactly what these people have done to you. Malcolm met his father's gaze. Then slowly he turned to Ethan. Ethan here called me a thief, humiliated me in front of guests, framed me, mocked me, and did everything he could to make sure I never rose above being a janitor. Victor's face darkened. Ethan stumbled over his words. Sir, I swear I didn't know who he was. Victor's voice was deadly calm. Oh, so if he wasn't my son, this treatment would be acceptable? Ethan shut his mouth. Victor turned to Clara. And you? What's your excuse? Clara's lip trembled. She had none. Victor sighed. Then, in a voice that shattered every remaining ounce of their power, he spoke. You're both fired. Immediately. Get out of my sight. The atmosphere in Horizon Haven Resort's grand lobby was thick with tension. Just moments ago, Ethan Reynolds and Clara Whitmore, the two individuals who had spent weeks tormenting Malcolm, had their worlds turned upside down. The truth had been revealed. Malcolm Hayes, the man they had mocked, framed, and humiliated, was not just another janitor. He was the son of Victor Hayes, the billionaire owner of Horizon Haven Resorts. And now, with his identity exposed and his father demanding answers, Malcolm held the power, and he was going to use it. Clara Whitmore stood frozen, her face drained of color. Ethan, usually so smug and composed, looked like he was going to be sick. You're both fired, immediately. Get out of my sight. Victor's words hung in the air like a thunderclap. A hush spread over the entire lobby. Employees stared in stunned silence. Guests whispered among themselves, and Clara staggered back, her lips trembling. Wait, Mr. Hayes, please. I didn't know, Clara stammered. Victor turned slowly to face her. You didn't know? His voice was eerily calm, deadly cold. So that justifies how you treated him? How you treated your staff? How you let an elderly woman collapse on the floor because of your cruelty? Clara shook her head wildly. It wasn't like that. Please, Mr. Hayes, I need this job. Victor snapped. You should have thought about that before you decided to abuse your power. Get out. Tears pricked the corners of Clara's eyes. She looked around, hoping anyone, would speak up for her. But there was nothing but silence. Then, as she turned to flee, a voice stopped her. Wait. She turned, hope flickering for just a moment. But then she realized it was Malcolm who had spoken. She flinched. Malcolm walked forward, his dark eyes locked onto hers. Before you leave, I want to make sure you remember something. Clara swallowed hard. Malcolm's expression didn't waver. You threw coffee across a clean table and made me wipe it down, just to humiliate me. You set me up for theft. You mocked me. You tried to break me. Clara's breathing was uneven. Malcolm's voice hardened. And yet, through it all, I was never beneath you. Clara's lips parted slightly, but she had no words left to say. The truth had already destroyed her. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the marble floor. All eyes turned to Ethan. He stood rigid, fists clenched, sweat beading his forehead. But instead of begging for forgiveness, his pride got the best of him. This is ridiculous, Ethan snapped, shaking his head. I built this resort. I made it successful. And now you're firing me? Because of him? Victor's face remained unreadable. Oh, you think you made this resort successful? Ethan's voice rose. I was the one keeping this place in order. Without me, it falls apart. I kept the right people in the right positions." "The right people?" Malcolm interrupted. "You mean people like you? Privileged, entitled, and willing to step on anyone who doesn't fit your idea of power?" Ethan's jaw clenched. Malcolm stepped closer, his presence now towering over Ethan. "You treated me like garbage because you thought I was just a janitor. You humiliated me, framed me, and dragged me through this very lobby like a criminal." Malcolm's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "But look where you're standing now." Ethan's breathing turned shallow, the realization sank in hard. He had lost. Victor exhaled and waved his hand dismissively. "Henderson, escort him out. I don't want to see his face again." The security chief grabbed Ethan by the arm. Ethan jerked away, his face red with anger. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Malcolm smiled. "No, Ethan, you'll regret this." And with that, Ethan was dragged out of the lobby, his once powerful position nothing more than a memory. With Ethan and Clara gone, the entire resort stood still. Then, slowly, the employees began whispering. Some nodded approvingly, others looked at Malcolm with newfound respect. Victor turned to Malcolm. "What do you want to do next, son?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "The first thing we do is promote the one person in this resort who actually deserves power." He turned to Sophia Carter, the assistant manager who had quietly helped employees, treated everyone with respect, and had never once mocked him. Sophia's eyes widened. Effective immediately, Sophia Carter is the new general manager of Horizon Haven Resorts. Gasps rippled through the room. Sophia stumbled forward, covering her mouth. "Malcolm, I don't know what to say." He smiled warmly. "That you accept, and that you'll help me turn this place into something better." Sophia blinked back tears. Then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and nodded. "I accept, and I won't let you down." The employees erupted into quiet applause. Change had begun. Malcolm didn't stop there. He announced sweeping changes across Horizon Haven Resorts. Increased wages for all employees. Mandatory anti-discrimination and bias training. A company-wide investigation into all resort branches to ensure no other locations were mistreating employees. A new anonymous employee complaint system to hold management accountable. Then he made one final move. Later that evening, Malcolm walked into the hospital room of Mrs. Johnson, the elderly housekeeper who had collapsed. She was sitting up, her frail hands gripping a cup of warm tea. When she saw Malcolm, she smiled tiredly. "I heard what happened, child," she said softly. "They finally got what they deserved, huh?" Malcolm sat beside her, his eyes softening. "They did, but I didn't come here to talk about them." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. Mrs. Johnson frowned. "What's this?" Malcolm handed it to her. "Your retirement package." She froze. "You don't have to work another day in your life, Mrs. Johnson. Your years of service deserve more than a paycheck. They deserve peace." Tears filled the old woman's eyes. "Oh, Lord," she whispered, pressing a hand to her chest. Malcolm reached out and held her other hand. "This is the start of something new." And for the first time since arriving at Horizon Haven, Malcolm Hayes knew he had done what he came here to do. He had changed everything. The sun hung low over Horizon Haven Resorts, casting a warm golden glow over the pristine coastline. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of change, long overdue, necessary, and irreversible change. For years, the resort had functioned on an unspoken rule of exclusivity, where power was reserved for a select few, and anyone who didn't fit the image was pushed into the shadows. But today, that system was dead, and Malcolm Hayes had made sure of it. From the outside, Horizon Haven still looked the same. The marble floor still gleamed, the grand chandelier still shimmered, and the elite clientele still walked through its doors. But something was different. For the first time in its history, the employees, every single one of them, regardless of race, background, or position, walked the halls with their heads held high. There was no more silent fear, no more forced submission to cruel, power-hungry superiors. Malcolm had torn down the hierarchy built on prejudice and replaced it with something real, something fair. And tonight, the world was about to see it. A large stage had been set up in the resort's grand ballroom. Employees, housekeepers, janitors, receptionists, managers, all gathered, standing side by side. The tension that once ruled this space was gone. Now there was only anticipation. As Malcolm stepped onto the stage, dressed in a sleek navy suit, the crowd erupted into applause. Not the kind given out of obligation, but the kind that came from deep, genuine respect. He let them have their moment before he raised his hand. Silence fell. Then he began. "A few weeks ago, I walked through these doors as a janitor." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many of them had seen it happen. "I cleaned the floors. I scrubbed the windows. I watched, and I learned." His voice was strong but steady. "I saw how people were treated when no one thought they mattered. I saw how power was used to silence, to oppress, to break people down. I saw racism hidden under the guise of professionalism." A hushed silence fell over the room. Malcolm took a deep breath. "But let me make one thing very, very clear. Respect is not a privilege, it is a right." Applause erupted like a wave. Some people stood, clapping so hard their hands turned red. Malcolm continued, "No longer will this resort be a place where people are judged by their skin color, by their background, or by how much power they appear to have. From today forward, Horizon Haven resorts will be built on one thing." He paused, scanning the crowd. "Integrity." The applause was deafening. And then, the cameras that were broadcasting the event to millions across the world captured what happened next. From the back of the room, Mrs. Johnson, the elderly housekeeper Malcolm had fought for, stood up, tears running down her cheeks. She started clapping, and one by one, the rest of the employees followed. A standing ovation for him, for justice, for the future. Malcolm swallowed the lump in his throat. This moment, this was bigger than him. The event had been live-streamed, but no one could have predicted what happened next. The video of Malcolm's journey, from being humiliated as a janitor to exposing the toxic culture within the resort, spread like wildfire. Hashtags exploded across the internet. Respect ISA right. End workplace racism. The real power. People from all industries shared their own experiences. Workers from hotels, corporations, hospitals, and restaurants came forward with their own stories of bias and mistreatment. This wasn't just about Horizon Haven anymore. It had started a movement. And at the center of it, Malcolm Hayes. While Malcolm's rise was making headlines, Ethan Reynolds and Clara Whitmore were nowhere to be seen. After their firings, their reputations crumbled. No other luxury hotel wanted to hire them. Everywhere they went, they were recognized. Clara had been caught on camera throwing coffee at Malcolm. The video had been watched millions of times, dissected frame by frame. Ethan's public humiliation in the lobby had become a meme, symbolizing the downfall of corrupt leaders. They tried to escape the backlash, but no matter where they went, they had to live with the consequences of their actions. And for the first time in their privileged lives, they learned what it felt like to be powerless. A month after the scandal, Malcolm sat in his new office, the CEO's office. He had never wanted power for power's sake, But now, he had the ability to ensure this resort would never return to its old ways. He looked at the list in front of him. New hires. For the first time, Horizon Haven Resorts had a truly diverse management team. People from all backgrounds, all races, all walks of life, finally given the opportunities they deserved. As he leaned back in his chair, the door opened. Sophia Carter, his newly promoted general manager, smiled. "They're ready for you." Malcolm stood. It was time to welcome his new team. The meeting room was buzzing with excitement. People, new hires, longtime employees, fresh leaders, looked up as Malcolm entered. He took his place at the front of the room, looked at the faces before him. And he smiled, because this was what leadership looked like. Not built on fear, not built on control, but on respect. And as Malcolm looked at his new team, at the bright future ahead, he knew his mother would have been proud. What would you do if you were in Malcolm's shoes? Imagine working tirelessly, only to be judged not by your skills, but by the color of your skin. Imagine being humiliated, set up, and silenced, until one day you decide to fight back. Malcolm Hayes didn't just reclaim his power, he changed an entire system. Now, it's your turn to speak up. Do you believe respect is a right, not a privilege? Should workplace discrimination be exposed and eradicated? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about leadership, justice, and standing up for what's right. Your voice matters.